In the summer of 1931, in a ridge community in Letcher County, Kentucky, 14 families made an agreement. Not a written agreement, nothing signed, nothing witnessed by any official body, nothing that the law would recognize as binding. An agreement of the kind that rural communities have always made and always kept better than written contracts, because the binding force was not paper but shared knowledge, and the understanding that the shared knowledge was more dangerous if it left the community than if it stayed. The 14 families knew something. They had all been present, in various capacities during the events of the preceding 3 weeks. They had seen the same thing, from different angles, and they had processed it through the same collective decision that this did not leave the ridge, that their children would be told not to discuss it, that the people who came asking, and people would come asking, because what had happened could not have happened without leaving some visible trace, would be told that nothing had happened that was worth talking about. This agreement held for nearly 40 years. It held because the 14 families meant it, and because the thing they had agreed not to talk about was the kind of thing that once you had seen it, you understood without being told why it should not travel any further. The agreement began to break in 1969, when a woman named Loretta Cadill, the granddaughter of one of the original 14 families, told a documentary filmmaker named Morris Hatch what her grandmother had told her the night before her grandmother died. What Loretta Cadill told Morris Hatch is still, more than 50 years later, the most complete account available of what happened on Gloomhaven Ridge in the summer of 1931. Drop your location in the comments before we go further. Tell me where you are watching from tonight, because the ridge in Letcher County that the families called Gloomhaven is still there, still called by that name locally, and the families whose grandparents made that agreement in 1931 are still in that county. The community at Gloomhaven Ridge in 1931 was old even by the standards of Letcher County, which had been continuously settled since the 1790s. The 14 families whose names appear in Loretta Cadill's account had family lines that went back to the original settlement. They had been on that ridge for 5 and 6 generations. They knew the ground the way people know ground they have worked and buried their dead in and hunted over and been born on for 140 years. They knew the specific places where the ridge behaved in ways that couldn't always be explained. The hollow near the head of the Second Creek branch where livestock refused to graze despite adequate cover and water. The stand of old-growth white oak at the south end of the ridge where no bird had nested within memory. The section of the main trail, approximately 200 yards in length, where travelers consistently reported a quality of disorientation that cleared once they passed through it. These were known features of the ridge. They had been known for generations. The families had accommodated them the way they accommodated everything on the ridge, by knowing the shape of the landscape and moving through it accordingly, without needing an explanation for every feature that the landscape presented. What happened in July and August of 1931 was different in kind from anything the ridge had previously presented. The sequence of events, as Loretta Cadill reported her grandmother's account, began on the night of July 9th when a man named Burnett Frazier, the adult son of one of the 14 families, came back to the ridge community from a 3-day trip to Whitesburg and reported that on the trail, at the 200-yard disorientation section, he had seen something that he could not describe in terms that anyone he told it to was able to visualize. He used the word opening. He said there had been an opening in the section that had not been there before, visible for a period he estimated at less than a minute before he passed through the section and it was behind him. He said opening the way you might say the word if you were describing something you were seeing for the first time without a prior word for it, as a description of function rather than form, as the best available term for something that did not have a name in the vocabulary he had available. His family accepted the account without apparent alarm, because Burnett Frazier was a reliable man and because that section of trail had a documented history of producing unusual reports. They filed it into the same category as everything else the ridge produced, and went on. 6 days later, on July 15th, a child named Vera Feltner, 8 years old, from the second family in the 14, came home from playing in the late afternoon and told her mother that something had spoken to her in the old-growth oak stand, that it had spoken from below ground level, that it had used her name and had asked her to come back after dark. Vera's mother took this seriously enough to go immediately to two neighboring families, and the combined households sat with Vera through the evening, and the child went to sleep before dark and was not taken to the oak stand and was not permitted to go there afterward. But the account, the speaking from below ground level, the use of the child's name, the instruction to return after dark, moved through the 14 families with a speed that suggested it landed differently than an ordinary child's story would land. It landed as a confirmation of something that some of the older family members had been expecting without admitting that they were expecting it. What the families had been expecting, what the older members knew and had not discussed formally in years, was not documented by any of them in writing. It exists only in Loretta Caudill's account of what her grandmother told her in 1969, which in turn exists only in the documentary film that Morris Hatch made from that conversation, and which has never been distributed commercially or aired on any broadcast platform. The film is in Hatch's personal archive, which passed to his daughter when he died in 2001. His daughter, in an email exchange with a researcher from the University of Kentucky in 2018, confirmed that the film exists and that she was not currently willing to discuss terms for any access to it. She said she had watched it once when she received it from her father's estate, and that she had decided the question of what to do with it required more thought than she had yet given it. What Loretta Caudill told Morris Hatch, and what her grandmother had told her, and what the 14 families had agreed in 1931 never to discuss, Hatch's production notes from the 1969 filming session are available. He kept detailed notes. He was a methodical documentarian. The notes describe the interview's content with the compression of a professional who is documenting for his own reference rather than for public consumption. They describe the events of July and August 1931 in terms that grow more specific and more difficult to summarize as the account progresses. The notes are in the University of Kentucky's Appalachian archive, donated by Hatch as research materials in 1987. They are not restricted. They have been accessed 11 times since their deposit. The events of August 1931, as the notes describe Loretta Caudill's account of what her grandmother described, involved all 14 families in a sustained and collective experience across 3 weeks that the families then chose, together, to seal. The experience centered on the 200-yard disorientation section of the trail and on the old-growth oak stand, and it involved something that those locations had been building toward, in the understanding of the older family members who had tracked the ridge's behavior across decades, for longer than any living family member could account for from personal observation. The opening Burnett Frazier had seen on July 9th was the beginning of a sequence that the older members had, when they heard his account, immediately recognized as the beginning that the stories they had been told as children had described. The speaking to Vera Feltner was the second element. The third element, which the notes describe in 2 sentences that stop short of full description, is the element that produced the agreement. Hatch's 2 sentences about the third element read, "She described what the 14 families witnessed in the final week of August as something that came up out of the oak stand ground over the course of 3 evenings, and what it did when it came up. And the word she used for what it looked like was not a word from any language I recognized, but I wrote it down phonetically and I will keep it in the notes and not in the film. The word is in the notes. It is spelled phonetically in Hatch's handwriting in the margin beside the 2 sentences. It is in the University of Kentucky archive. It is not restricted. It is available to any researcher who accesses the collection and reads the production notes for the 1969 Caudle interview. The 14 families watched what came up from the oak stand over 3 evenings in August 1931. They watched it and they recognized it, through the stories of the older members, as the thing those stories had been about. They reached an agreement the following morning. The agreement held for 38 years until the night before a grandmother died and she told her granddaughter what she had seen because she had decided she did not want to take it entirely into the ground with her. Loretta Caudill waited 20 years after her grandmother's death before she told Morris Hatch, because Loretta Caudill had also grown up with the agreement and it held in her even after the grandmother who had initiated her into it was gone. The oak stand is still on the south end of Gloomhaven Ridge. The 200-yard section of trail is still there. Letcher County is still there. The descendants of the 14 families are still in it. The word Hatch wrote phonetically in the margin of his 1969 production notes is still in the University of Kentucky archive, accessible to any researcher who asks for the collection and works through the notes to find it. What came up from the ground in August 1931, and what it did, and what the 14 families decided together could not leave the ridge, that is in a documentary film in a private archive owned by a woman who watched it once and has been thinking ever since about what to do with it. The film is the fullest account. The notes are the only available approximation. The word in the margin is the only piece of what the grandmother told Loretta Caudill that is in any public record anywhere. I want to know what you think the 14 families saw. Not based on the word in the margin, I am not going to read it here, because I agree with Hatch's decision to keep it in the notes and not in the film. But based on what you know about what the oldest ridges in eastern Kentucky have held for generations, and what the oldest oak stands have been growing over, and what a 200-yard section of trail has been disorienting travelers about since before any of the 14 families were born. Drop your answer in the comments. The question has been on Gloomhaven Ridge since 1931. It has not been answered by any document that is available for general reading. What do you think it was? Some agreements hold because both parties know what the alternative looks like. The 14 families knew. They had seen it. And they lived with what they had seen in the specific way that people live with knowledge they have decided the rest of the world is not ready for. Quietly, privately, in the long shadow of a summer that ended with a word that no one would put in a film. The University of Kentucky's Appalachian Archive received Hatch's production notes in 1987. The archivist who processed the collection noted in the finding aid that the notes from the 1969 Caudill interview were in unusually detailed condition, better organized and more complete than Hatch's notes from comparable interviews in the collection. The archivist wrote that this suggested the Caudill interview was one Hatch considered significant and had invested particular care in documenting. The finding aid does not comment on the content of the notes. Hatch himself published a book in 1978 on Appalachian oral history and documentary practice, a well-regarded academic text that is still used in regional studies programs. The book includes a chapter on ethical decisions in documentary work, when to film, when to withhold, how to manage the relationship between documentation and community harm. The chapter does not mention the Caudill interview specifically. It includes a passage that is widely cited in the field. The documentarian who has been shown something by a community that trusted him with it faces a question that professional ethics can prepare him for, in principle, but not in specific. In the specific, you are alone with what you have been shown, and the community that showed it to you is not available to advise you on what to do with it, because the showing was the act of trust, and the aftermath is yours to manage. I have made decisions I cannot fully justify, and I stand by them because they were made in good faith with the information I had. That is all any documentarian can say. That passage was written in 1978, 9 years after the Caudill interview. It reads, knowing that context, as a passage about a specific decision managed in general terms for a general audience. The specific decision was the film. The film is in a private archive. The notes are in a public archive. The word is in the margin. And Hatch spent the 23 years between 1978 and his death in 2001 standing by a decision he could not fully justify, and stating in print that good faith and available information were the only standards a documentarian could apply. Whether those standards were adequate to what he was shown on a recording in Letcher County in 1969 by a woman who had carried the knowledge since the night her grandmother described the August evenings of 1931, that is a question his daughter is still thinking about. The film is in her care. The question of what to do with it is in her care. And until she decides, the fullest account of what came up from the ground on Gloomhaven Ridge in the summer of 1931 and what it did when it came up is in a private archive in the possession of a woman who has watched it once and is still deciding. Some things are put on film so they will not be lost. Some things are put in a private archive because the person who put them there was not willing to make the decision that sharing them required. The two purposes are not always compatible. Hatch was a documentarian who understood that incompatibility as well as anyone in his field ever has, and he still made the film, and he still kept it, and he still died without making it available. His daughter has been thinking about it for 23 years. The ridge is still there, the oak stand is still at its south end, and the word in the margin of the production notes is in the University of Kentucky archive, waiting for the researcher who works through the collection far enough to find it and is then left, as Hatch was left, alone with what they have been shown and responsible for deciding what to do with it. Subscribe and stay with us. The archives are deep, and the agreements that communities make about what should not leave the ridge are older than any of the institutions those communities eventually sent their documents to. And sometimes the documents carry the agreement with them in a margin note that has been accessible for 40 years to any researcher who got that far in the collection and then had to decide what to do with what they found. The 11 other access events in the University of Kentucky archives log for the Hatch collection, 11 researchers over nearly 40 years who have worked through the production notes and reached the margin of the 1969 Cottle interview, have produced no published work on Gloomhaven Ridge, or on the events of 1931, or on the word Hatch wrote phonetically in the margin. 11 researchers over 4 decades. None of them published. Whether this is because the word produced no usable scholarly conclusion, or because each of those 11 researchers made, individually and independently, the same decision Hatch made in 1969 to document and hold rather than document and release, is a question the access log cannot answer. What the access log can tell you is that 11 people got to that margin and are, as far as the archive knows, still sitting with what they found. They went in with whatever question they arrived at the archive with. They left with what is in that margin. And not one of them has published a word about it in the 40 years since the collection was deposited. That is not the pattern of 11 researchers who found nothing. That is the pattern of 11 people who found something and made a decision. 11 good faith decisions with available information, standing by choices that cannot be fully justified. In the specific tradition of the documentarian who wrote about that tradition in 1978, 9 years after he was shown something in a room in Letcher County that he decided was better held than shared. The ridge is still there. The word is still in the margin. You can go to the archive. The collection is accessible. The decision about what to do with what you find in the margin, that one is yours to make, and the archive will have no record of what you decided, only a record that you were there.